Je me rappelle, il y a pas si longtemps, en fait, ça fait
I remember it's not so long ago, about 11 years ago,
il y avait eu une activité
there was an activity
organisée
that was
dans
organized in downtown Montreal for 2
par le gouvernement
days
du Québec. Ça
by the
s'appelait
Quebec Parliament. It was
Ensemble
called
contre l'intimidation et le
Together
hameçonnage.
Against
Je sais qu'il y a au moins une personne ici de
Bullying,
Pepper qui
and
était,
perhaps
parce
a few
que
people were
on avait tous
there
les deux fait la
because
conférence d'ouverture, mais je sais
we
pas s'il y
had
en a
both
parmi
spoken
vous
at
qui
the
étaient
opening conference, but I don't know if anybody was
quelques-uns. Bon.
there.
Alors, depuis 11 ans,
So
je pense que la tenue d'un colloque,
I think this type of symposium shows that there's still work to be done, naturally speaking, and there will always be work to be done because education is always a new beginning, as it were. But what's important, and as my colleague Shelley Heine underlined, there have been very important development over the last few years on those factors that condition and bring us to have this type of bullying. So there was research done on a large scale for different programs concerning the efficiency or the reduction in regards to bullying and victimization. And it's obvious that there's a lot of work to be done still, and I will try.
OK, parfait. Excusez, c'est parce que j'ai pas une bonne vue ici.
I'm sorry, I can't quite see what's going on.
Il y a eu beaucoup de choses qui ont été faites.
Many things have been done, and I participated in certain evaluative studies trying to test the efficiency of certain programs to prevent violence, notably bullying. But I've also, as Mr. Griffon mentioned, worked on questions of school environments and setting up these programs. So I will focus today on basically the creation of well-meaning school communities. And I'll work on 2 questions. So the first could be obvious. So why is this essential? And once again, Ms. Heimel underlined the importance of the role of the social environment, of peers, of the educational environment in the emergence or reduction of problems of intimidation and victimization. There are many things that were developed in regards to programs, and we noticed that the programs had a certain effect, but they had certain limits as well. And one of the reasons, and this is my argument today, is to explain these programs have a value in the measure that they are implemented and insert themselves in the general organization of a well-meaning school community. So it's important to perhaps ask to set as a first stage, how is the educational social environment, how does it play a role basically in child's psychological well-being, and what effect, how does it lead to bullying? And the second question is, how do we get there? There are programs that exist, we've discussed them, and these programs are not a panacea. These programs are invested or started in a milieu, as it were, places where people live, people work, children play, has its own rules, and it's important to take a look as well on those, on the educational environment as it were. And at the same time, there's a very straight link between social and school learning, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit as well. Obviously, once again, it's a truism that I will say, is that one of the missions of our educational system is socialization. The law on public education says that education, socialization are the missions of the school, but the socialization mission, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, when I was at the opening conference, was something that was still emerging. It means we still had the vision that children would develop themselves by putting them together, by making them work together, by sending them into the schoolyard, or having them exchange, having common activities, and that socialization, friendships would develop thus. And it was the role of adults to organize such activities and to ensure the security. This vision is changing because we realized that there were problems, behavioral problems, and these problems became more and more significant over the last few years. I think if we see cyber intimidation, which Mr. Passion will talk about later. But in the school environment, there are more studies that showed that there was an increase in bullying and violence in general. We have a law, Bill 56, which recalls or reminds us of our socialization mission, but we now have to realize that we have to reduce incidents of violence and bullying, and we have a administrative and legal framework to school, but we don't tell them how to do it or how to proceed in regards to classes or whatnot. So we're telling school boards, and you have to develop good practices or go get pre-existing practices and implement them. So the road is half paved, as it were. Once again, the responsibility comes to the responsibility of the school educational institutions. But in order to be able to make this choice, they have to understand as well how they have an influence on education and on violent behavior as well. Once again, the question of numbers. So we decided to have this meeting today because cyberbullying is becoming more and more prevalent. There's an important significant increase in violence in schools, and I have a tendency to rather dramatize everything. Yes, there's an increase, it's a phenomenon, but we're also more vigilant. We analyze these aspects more, and we are asking ourselves more questions. So since I've been studying this, since I realized, regardless if it goes up or down, there are always children who will suffer, who will have difficulty, and it's our mission or our duty that these children have a harmonious social development. UNESCO recently said in a 2013 report the importance that psychological and physical welfare, how important it was for a child's development. It was obvious, but it's important to recall it. As I said, we have a duty of intervention because regardless of the importance of the studies have shown that there are problems in development. So it's important to act. Also, because the educational environment is one of the important aspects for psychological and physical development. So I think the results are rather evident. So what's important to recall, and Shelley did it before from the research from other specialists, it's that vicious circle in which intimidation acts find themselves. It means the bullying, there's the bully, there's the victim, but there's also the supporters, the bystanders, as it were. And this dynamic is within a particular environment. It doesn't develop spontaneous. It's a social organization. And this dynamic was put into evidence by Ms. Pepler and Ms. Craig a few years ago, where we said specific actions in the environment can have a major effect on reduction of bullying.
Now, I'd like to present to you. Now, you'll see a whole series of slides. There's about 35 of them. I assure you that we're not going to look at all 35 of them, but it's just to send you a subliminal message. I'm going to show you a first slide. I'm going to explain it to you, and then after you'll see all the other slides are the same. So let's not go crazy. So the slides that I want to show you, the results, come from a study that was done between 1989 and 2002 with my colleagues Christiane Boutier, who's here in the room, Nadia Desbiens, and Roch Chouinard. Other colleagues as well joined us. This is a study that was done with 200, at least, or over 200 schools, elementary and high schools in Quebec at the beginning of the 2000s, up until around 2002. And this was a study on violence in Quebec schools. It was a first large-scale scope study that was undertaken at the time. There were a lot of results came out of this research, of this study. And one of the results, one of the findings that was most interesting was the establishment effect. We always ask ourselves, versus the social family origin of the child, what influence does the school have? Obviously, we know it because we're teachers, we're educators, we've got a role to play, and we can distinguish between the two. But how? And how does the establishment have an effect on this? So I'm going to show you a first slide on the perception and victimization for students in elementary school. As you can see here, you're going to ask yourselves, what does this do? What's this for? What does this show? You've got 3 columns. Each bar is a score. This is the average of the scores of victimization, insults received by students. Students self-signaled or self-declared. They answered a questionnaire. We said, have you been a victim of insults in the past 2 weeks? And they answered. We took all the scores of the children. We did an average by school. We asked the same question to teachers, and you'll see that later. So insults, threats, fights, physical aggressions, physical assault, insults from an adult. So we did some averages, and what you've got here is the average per school. And look closely. You've got 3 series of columns: high, moderate, and low. These are the levels of socioeconomic status. You've got 1 to 5 is quite well off, moderate 6 to 8, and low is 9 to 10. Sometimes we say that people who come from underprivileged environments are more violent or have more adaptation difficulties. We've talked about this also with kids dropping out. So what you can see here is quite interesting. You can see that there are some considerable gaps within each one of these categories. There are gaps that are quite significant. And what this means is that the establishment has an effect. Obviously, we're going to say, well, how do they interact? But the establishment, institution effect is quite present, and we didn't invent any of this. The first researchers in the 60s and 70s who were looking for proof on the institution effect used this type of graph. So now I'm going to start with my subliminal work. So here you can see these are threats. I'm going to go for the first series, and then after I'm going to go quite quickly because I've got too much information here to share with you. So insults, threats. Look at the variation. Look at the gaps. That means that at some point there is an effect for the school, regardless of the socioeconomic level of the children. There are quite important variations. Physical, and here is taxing. And here insults from adults. Look, there are a lot of children who signal up to between 20 and 30%, between 10 and 20 on average. These are averages. So when we talk about violence between children, that's fine. But children say that sometimes they're insulted, sometimes people may tease them. It's not necessarily violent acts, terrible violent acts, but children see themselves as victims. And then afterwards, we've got the perception, and I'm going to go very quickly here because this is the same process. So obviously it varies. And then we ask students in high school the same question, and look. Victimization, insults from an adult in high school. And it's interesting. Afterwards, the perception, because we asked them 2 types of questions. Have you been victimized, and do you perceive violence in the school? But the data on perception is the same thing. So there are significant gaps between the schools within the same socioeconomic levels. And I think this is evidence of the school effect. It doesn't tell us exactly why the school has an effect, but it is an effect. And now if we continue, we look at teachers. We ask teachers a question because we're talking about a caring community here, well, caring for our children, but also caring for teachers and adults and the school staff. So this is the distribution of insults from students to a teacher. So teacher reported this since the beginning of the year. Look, in certain cases, it goes up to 50%. 50% of the whole of the students who answered the questionnaire in this school.
menaces, agressions
threats,
physiques, insultes
physical assault,
de la part
insults
d'un adulte
from an adult
vers un autre adulte.
towards another adult.
Ça, c'est un collègue de travail
And that's
ou
a
un parent
colleague or a
qui s'est
parent
adressé de façon pas très gentille
who
à
did
un
not speak
enseignant.
very nicely to a
C'est
teacher.
ça que ça veut dire.
That's what it means.
Là aussi, vous avez un effet
And here
établissement
again, you've got a
Vous
school
avez
effect. It's
une
quite significant.
dispersion,
You've got a
énorme
dispersion that is huge.
Voilà. Bon, je continue
So
sur
I'm
la
continuing
perception.
with
Et
perception
là, on était
here.
au primaire,
And
au
we were at
secondaire,
elementary school
les
and in high
enseignants
school,
rapportent
teachers
avoir été victimisés
who say they've been victimized,
pour ensuite, bon, pour les menaces,
threats,
l'agression physique,
physical
des
assault,
insultes de la part d'un autre
insults
adulte,
from another
et voilà.
adult, and there you go.
Et ensuite, on y va avec
And
la
then
perception.
the perception.
Bon, là, j'espère de ne pas vous avoir trop
So I hope
assommé avec
I haven't confused you too much
cette cascade de graphiques
with
qui sont
all of
assez
these
simples
graphs.
à
They're quite
comprendre dans
simple
la
to
mesure où ils sont
understand
tous semblables aussi.
because they all
Et
kind
je
of look the
pense
same.
que c'est
And I
une
think
première
that
illustration très
it's a first
simple
illustration
du fait
that's
qu'il y a
very
des
simple of the fact that there are
variations
variations,
importantes
significant
Ces
variations between schools. And these
variations-là
variations
s'expliquent naturellement par toutes sortes de
can
raisons.
be due to all
S'expliquent
sorts of
par le
reasons.
fait
It
que
could be
certaines
because of the
écoles
fact
ont
that
mis en
certain
place
schools
des
have
mesures,
put in place some measures,
ont une
have a
politique,
policy,
ont un code de vie adéquat, mais c'est aussi parce
code,
que
an ethics code that is
considèrent
adequate, but it's also because they
l'environnement comme un
consider the
véritable
environment
milieu
as
de
a
vie.
true
Et
living
ici,
space.
on parle pas
And here we're not
juste
just
de
talking about
bonnes pratiques
good
pour
practices
aider à réduire
to
l'intimidation
reduce
ou, la
bullying
victimisation,
or
mais
victimization,
d'un ensemble de pratiques.
but of a
Ici, on
set
parle
of
pas d'un
practices. We're
programme.
not talking about
Ici,
a
on
program
parle-
here.
ce
Here
que
we're
vous
talking
avez,
about
encore
what
une fois,
you've
c'est un
got here.
graphique qui est un
Once
peu,
again, is a graph
ce
that's
que vous avez autour
a little
avec
bit
les
busy. What
carrés,
you've got
ce sont
around in
des
the squares or in the
pratiques,
rectangles,
stratégies
these are strategic
occasions d'investissement,
practices,
soutien aux
opportunities to
adultes,
invest,
gestion de
supporting
crise, etc., etc.
children who
Dans
have
le milieu, ce que
difficulties,
vous avez,
crisis management,
c'est les
etc.
climats
In
éducatifs,
the
les
middle,
climats
what you've got
relationnels,
is
les
the
climats de
relational
sécurité, les
and
climats
educational, justice,
Et dans le milieu,
social
vous avez
environment.
problèmes.
And in the middle, you've got the
Décrochage,
problems. So dropouts,
échec scolaire, conflits,
children who are failing in school,
violence,
conflicts,
etc.
absenteeism, violence,
Ça, c'est
etc.
un modèle que
So this is a
mon
model
collègue
that
Michel
my
Janos
colleague
a
Michel
développé en
Janos has developed in
1998 et
1998,
que nous avons testé,
and which
lui
we've
et moi, à
tested
travers différentes études avec nos
through
collègues
different
dans les années
studies with our
2000.
colleagues in the
Et
2000s.
le postulat premier de
And the
ce-
first
de ce modèle-là,
hypothesis
ce
of
qui est
this
important
model,
de
what's
retenir
important to
au-delà du
remember here
graphique,
beyond
c'est
the
que,
graphs
bien sûr,
is that,
les-
yes, obviously,
les pratiques ont un impact,
the practices
les
have an
pratiques
impact.
d'enseignement ont un
Our
impact
teaching
sur,
practices have an
le
impact
comportement
on
des jeunes,
the behavior
mais
of children,
le climat que
but
génèrent
the
ces
climate that
ont
these
un
practices
impact aussi grand, sinon
have
plus, que juste
an
nos
impact that
pratiques.
is just as great, if not
Et-
greater, than just the
Et là,
practices.
la
And
question, c'est à
the
quel
question
moment
is, well,
l'ensemble de nos pratiques
when do
créent
all of
un
our
climat de
practices, when do they
sécurité, créent un
create
bon climat
a safe
relationnel,
climate, a
créent
good
un bon
relational
climat
climate, a
d'appartenance, créent un
good
bon
sense of
climat
belonging,
éducatif.
a good educational
Ça reste-
climate?
la
And
recherche doit chercher en-
research
en
has to go
la recherche doit
deeper.
chercher encore la réponse.
Research has to go
On
deeper
n'en
to
est pas
find
encore
the answer.
rendu.
We are
Mais
not
ce
there
qu'on a
yet.
démontré
But we've
clairement,
demonstrated
Michel et moi,
clearly,
c'est
Michel and I,
qu'il y a
is that
un lien
there is a link
naturellement avec le climat scolaire
naturally
et
with the school
l'adaptation
setting
sociale. Et
and
ça,
social
on n'a pas
adaptation and school
inventé
adaptation.
ça.
We haven't
Par contre,
invented
ce qu'on a
anything
mis en
here.
évidence,
But what we
c'est qu'il y
have
avait
shown
un
is that
effet
there
de
was
synergie
a synergy
par les
effect
pratiques qui créaient des
through the
climats. Et ces
practices that
climats-là,
created these types of
c'est-à-dire la
climates or
perception d'un
environments.
environnement
So
sécuritaire,
the
la
perception of a
perception
safe
que les gens
environment,
vont
the
bien, la
relationships
perception qu'on est
between the
écouté et
students,
respecté
the
par les
perception that we
enseignants.
are listened
Ça empêche
to
pas d'enseignants de
and
perdre patience à un moment donné,
respected
ça
by
empêche
teachers.
pas
That
un
doesn't
jeune
mean
de
that
perdre
teachers
patience non
don't
plus.
lose our patience
Mais
at some
au-delà
point,
des
and same thing with the
réactions,
children, but beyond
c'est la
reactions,
perception du
it's a
milieu qui
perception
joue.
of the
Et ça joue
environment
autant pour la
that comes
réduction
into
de la
play, and it
violence que
plays
pour
as
la
much for the
motivation
reduction
scolaire.
of violence than for motivation to do well in school.
Plus spécifiquement, et là,
More
je vais aller très
specifically, and here I'm going to go
rapidement
very
parce que
quickly
je sais que le
because I
temps
know that I'm
file à
running
une
out of
vitesse
time.
incroyable. Si on veut
If we
implanter
want
des
to
programmes,
implement
comme
programs,
parlait Shelley tout à l'heure,
like Shelley was
les
saying
programmes,
earlier,
il faut les voir dans
well,
un
programs,
ensemble.
we have to see
Il
them
faut les
as
voir
a whole.
soutenus
We
par
have
une
to see them
philosophie
supported by
claire et
philosophy that is
précise
clear
de
and
l'école.
precise
Il faut les
in
voir
the school. We have
soutenus
to
par
see
des
them supported by
orientations,
orientations
des règlements pour contrer la
and
violence.
rules to fight
Le programme
violence.
vient
The program
appuyer cette
supports
philosophie et
this
ces
philosophy and
orientations-là,
these
mais tout ça s'insère à
guidelines,
l'intérieur d'un
but all of
environnement
this is
social
within
général.
a general
On ne peut
social
pas
environment. We
prendre un
cannot
programme.
take a
Un
program.
programme, c'est un peu comme un
You know, a
corps
program is a
étranger
bit
qu'on
like a
amène
foreign
dans
body
un
that we
organisme
bring into an
vivant qu'on
organization,
appelle
a
une
living
école.
organization that
Et
we call the
il
school.
faut que
And we
ce
have to,
programme-là,
that
non seulement
program
réponde aux
not
besoins,
only has to
mais,
meet the needs
aux besoins qui ont été évalués,
that
mais
were
également
evaluated, but
s'insère à
also
l'intérieur des pratiques.
has to fit within the
Parce que, de toute façon,
practices,
les gens
because
vont
anyways, people
éventuellement
are eventually
développer de
going
nouvelles
to
pratiques.
develop
Je
new
passe rapidement
practices. And now I'm
parce
going
qu'on
quickly
a le
because
pendant négatif.
we've got the negative side here. So, in summary, what is a caring school for children and adults? It's an organization, individuals who work together to reach common goals. We have to remember that a school is an organization for whom the quality of learning is just as important as their psychological well-being and their social development. A community that has a means to get there, that's capable of mobilizing itself and to get organized to implement these means. It's also a community of practices that mobilize itself to face crisis situations when there is bullying and victimization situations. When I evaluated the implementation of the product, Vers le Pacifique, I realized that schools that had the best rate of implementation of the program were the schools for which the principals and the teachers and members of the staff had answered the questionnaire on the socio-educational environment. They gave a very high rate to the following question: our school is ready to handle crisis situations. But this was a very general thing. Well, what's a crisis situation? Michel and I said, well, we should have asked maybe more detailed questions, but we couldn't ask more questions. We already had 112 questions in the questionnaire, and we had to stop at some point. But I discovered that a school where they implemented Vers le Pacifique, one day there was a case, a serious bullying case. The program Vers le Pacifique at the time had not been developed specifically for bullying. It helped, but it was more provincial, general provincial program. And there I saw the environment get mobilized. I saw the principal have information meetings, go and get the police. There was a police officer that came in. They organized a series of actions around the victim, but also around the aggressor and his family, as well as the witnesses, because this had been going on for 2 years. Can you imagine? So there were witnesses of this bullying. And there I saw an environment that was able to get mobilized. In Ontario, I saw an environment where there were so many problems that the program that I tried to implement lasted about 3 months. And often we come to the conclusion, because when we would evaluate the school environments, the people used to say, well, we want to put in place such and such a program, but they had relational problems that were huge between the teachers and the principal. And we would always say, well, why don't you start by fixing your problems and then we'll try to implement programs. So the message, what I want to say to you is that implementing caring communities requires a know-how, obviously, but it also requires a way of being. So attitudes that really look at the importance of the psychological well-being of the youth as well as their development in school. An environment where a child feels good is not where an environment where they work less. Research has shown that environments which work well when it comes to the socio-emotional domains there are also environments where the school requirements are quite high. So they're not incompatible, they're not mutually exclusive. And we see now that good behaviors are not necessarily linked to doing well in school, but adequate behaviors also reinforce success in schools. So beyond the vision of a program that will fix all of our violence programs, we have to really empower ourselves and adopt these new practices, even if at some point we have to modify certain parts of this program. And now I'm a little bit unorthodox when I compare myself to other researchers. Well, for me, the program is a pretext to bring change. It's a way to bring change. And where the activities that are promoted by the program have been maintained for the longest time, in my experience as a researcher, it's in environments where at some point they not only integrated the practices or the content of the program to the practices that they already had, but up to a certain point, they kind of put the program aside because they integrated them in their day-to-day practices. So it's this type of thought process that we have to have when it comes to a program and interventions. We have to well understand our environment, and we have to understand how the environment can change. So we have to see the school as a real living environment, not just a safe environment for children. It's not just a question of safety. Adults, caring adults who help, share, and really become models for the students and who work together. It's a community of practice. We have to break down the paradigm of of people who just work in their own classroom and by themselves in silos. I'm almost done. I know that I've gone over my time. We also have to evaluate the socio-educational environment and what we need to change. We've got tools that we've developed with Christiane Boutier and Michel Janos about 10 years ago, but there are other tools that help us evaluate the social environment and the educational environment in schools. We have to look at what our training needs are. We've done progress when it comes to training teachers over the past 15 years, but there's still work to do. And we can't all teach in 4 years. We can't teach everything in the university. And now here's my last graph, I promise. This is very simple. So in the dark line is those who have 8 years or more of experience, so teachers with 8 or more years. In yellow, between 4 and 7 years, and in pink, these are our new teachers. So this is a study still on the violence in schools. Look at our young who have less than 3 years of experience. Their level of victimization, insults, threats, physical assaults more than 3 times, they are not all very high, but you see threats, insults, physical assault, they are way above. They have way more than the teachers who have more years of experience. What does that mean? Does it mean that we're not preparing them well in university to face violence? In part, it's true, but we've still given them a lot of tools to manage our classrooms. But the conditions of professional insertion, isolation, the precarity of their jobs, you know, that young teachers go from one school to the other, all of this contributes to the fact that perhaps they're more victimized, or they perceive that they're more victimized. If you ask a young student, a young teacher, well, they're going to say, well, you know what, I've got to survive. Yeah, we're going to reduce violence, but we have to act with cohesion. So we have to take into consideration these factors when we implement a program. My last principle is educability. Philippe Mérieux. He says that everybody that we want to educate can be educated. For example, when you're dealing with a real brute, a real bully, you can say to yourself, well, there's not much to do with a child like this. And the bully has become what he is through, he's become a victim as well. And he can also unlearn in the same way. So we have to keep in mind this principle of how they can be educated. I'm not saying that we have to be saints and we have to accept everything that's going on, but I think that when we're talking about attitudes, okay, that's part of an attitude. And this is kind of our principle, a basic principle that brings us to want to be teachers. But Mérieux says, if you don't believe in this principle, you're better off changing jobs. And he's right. But it's hard sometimes to always believe that everybody can be educated. In closing, I'm going to close off with a quote. It's not ideas that lead the word, but they're management. That may seem huge, but when you implement a program or new practices, you have to do an analysis of the situation, you have to establish a plan, you have to develop a plan with clear objectives, you have to choose the means you're going to use, implement them, do a follow-up, and evaluate them. And I call this management. And don't lose sight of that, please. And as Shelley said, it's not because it works in one place that it works elsewhere. Often, it's not that the program is not compatible, it's because the management or the implementation mode is not adequate, and we have to keep that element in mind. In closing, Thomas Edison said an invention is 1% inspiration and 99% sweat, or transpiration. And I think that we've got a lot of things to inspire us here today, but we're going to have to sweat a little bit as well, so I hope that we'll all sweat a lot today and have a wonderful conference, and thank you for your attention.